Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is the 2020 Tribal and State Leaders Health Summit, and this is the Tribal Food Sovereignty session and panel. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to go ahead and get started. Let's see, to let you know that we have several people that will join us. Speaker Ade Romero Brios, the Director of Programs at the Native Agricultural and Food Systems First Nations Development Institute, has joined us today. And she, anyway, is going to share some of the things that she does work across the nation, and her organization has done great work in supporting tribes and tribal communities in developing their food system. So really look forward to hearing from Ade. And then we have a leadership panel. Charlene Christ, the Vice Chair of the Squaxin Island Tribe, is joining us, and looking forward to hear from Charlene. And Azul Bourrier, and Azul, you're going to have to correct my pronunciation. I apologize for that. The Traditional Food and Medicine Program Coordinator for the Suquamish Tribe, and Andy Joseph, Councilman from the Confederated Tribes of Colville. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started with the panel, I'm going to give a brief overview and with respect to the work that the Commission has engaged in on this topic, but will be hopefully a brief overview, because we really want to hear from our speakers in our panel. Okay, so I'm Jan Ward Olmsted. I am Chumash. I am a descendant from San Ynez and Barbareño, California Mission Indians. And I have lived in the Pacific Northwest for over 40 years, and have done really have been very blessed to be engaged in doing the various work that I've been able to do with the Commission, and over the last 9 years. And then before that, with the state, working with tribes, and certainly a number of community efforts. I've been a student of Billy Frank Jr. For over 20 years, about 25 years. And one of the things that Billy always reminded me of was the connection to the salmon, and its and the relationship between humans and salmon, in terms of the health of the salmon. He'd say, the health of the salmon will determine what our health will be for the future. And so I always think about that. I think about Billy all the time, and the wisdom that he shared with myself and my family, and certainly do miss him. I also want to just let you know that Cindy Gamble, I'm going to ask Cindy to introduce herself. Cindy is someone who I work very closely with, also a consultant with the American Indian Health Commission, and we do this work together. So Cindy, will you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, hello everyone. Cindy Gamble Flinkett from Southeast Alaska, the nation up there, and have lived down here for a long time. I love my work with the American Indian Health Commission and Jan and the other folks, and this is really important work. I'm the lead for the maternal infant health and WIC and nutrition, but as you know, it all comes together. That all touches, all these pieces touch each other, and food sovereignty and first foods has a huge impact on the health of our babies and our moms. So I'm happy to be a part of this session and can't wait to hear the panelists. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start with this, the Pulling Together for Wellness framework, and I'm not going to go into detail here. I know I've talked quite a bit about the framework during the summit, but I just want to share that, as Cindy mentioned, the maternal infant health work, and you can see here that maternal infant health work, really, we see that as foundational work. When you think about that life course approach or the 7-generation principles that we talk about a lot. Anyway, so I just wanted to continue to show this and to make certain that we're always aligning to the Pulling Together for Wellness. That's what the Commission's work. We're aligning our public health work with this thinking. One of the things that I will say is that you can see all of the yellow silos or buckets here. And we started actually looking at public health work in the sense of there's various different projects that we work on, but really they're all linked together because we don't, as people, we don't separate ourselves that way. And so we'll talk more about that as we go along. So initially in doing this work, the Pulling Together for Wellness was work that started from doing tobacco prevention work and chronic disease prevention. And in that effort, there became a tribal leadership advisory committee that was established and decided that as we were approaching this work, they asked us to step back and take a broader look and think about getting to the roots of issues related to tobacco use because we knew that the numbers were high. And so we took a different view based upon what tribal leaders told us. I did one-on-ones with tribal leaders, and it was really clear they knew what the risk factors in their community were. And it wasn't just about tobacco, it was about many things. And they were really clear about what those things were. They acknowledged the lack of evidence, the lack of effective evidence-based practices in tribal and urban Indian settings, and talked a lot about the problematic terminology in using that term evidence-based practice. And we very quickly started using different terminology and just really acknowledging that, many of the strategies that CDC set out really were not effective in our communities. And the way they talked about it was really doing more harm than good. And so we started thinking about how do we turn this around and really send out strength-based messages. From there, we developed, with the guidance from tribal leaders, key values and principles that eventually became the PTW definitions, vision, and values, and you'll see that in just a moment. And we really sought to integrate Native and Western epistemologies, the root of knowledge. And possession culture is a key factor in health prevention, and that was the guidance that we got from them. This is just the definition of the Pulling Together for Wellness framework. It's a comprehensive framework. It's tribally driven, culturally grounded, and again, through the guidance of tribal and urban Indian leaders here in this state, and it is evidence informed. This is the framework itself, and as you can see, that we look at health from a very holistic standpoint, use the medicine wheel approach in defining health as not just physical health, but mental, spiritual, and emotional health. And the tribal leaders decided the medicine wheel was something that most Native Americans understand, they know what it is. And another thing that they made very clear is that culture needed to be center in this approach, and because culture touched all parts of our health. We were also directed to look at that. It's not just tobacco thinking, digging deeper to the roots of some of the health disparities, health inequities, and that's how we began to look at the adverse childhood experiences study, and then what science was telling us. Many of our elders already knew really clearly, would make that connection, maybe use different terminology, but that sent us down the road in developing the generational clarity work, that healing work. This is the what we call the heart of the Pulling Together for Wellness framework, the vision and values. And I'm just going to say here that the vision statements, many vision statements are considered aspirational statements. We say these are operational because we actually put them to work in guiding our strategies. This is a matrix, and it's very linear, but again, this is that concept of mixing indigenous with Western science, indicating the direction that we want to head with vision. You can see the vision statement here, goals, and this is just a sample. We're using food sovereignty as an example here, indicators, and we have our own indicators. So indicators and then strategies. And here we're looking for evidence-based, practice-based strategies and promising practices and best practices from community-driven work. So let's see, and this is just an example. Another thing that that guides us is using the 7th generation principles that is to develop strategies, and that is standing in the present, in the center, looking back 3 generations for the wisdom and experience of your elders, your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, taking that wisdom and knowledge, putting it in current context today where you stand, and looking forward 3 generations to the protection of the next ones, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. And the thinking there is that that's your reach if you're fortunate to live that full life, to be able to touch the lives on both ends of that spectrum. That's your really stretch of responsibility. That doesn't mean that we don't think beyond the 3 generations in both directions, and that's where we take into account this thinking of the generational clarity. And this is really ways to integrate historical experience and historical trauma, and think about, the impacts of historical trauma. We know that from the research that has been by many scholars, Native scholars, that adverse childhood experiences are a result of historical trauma. And so we're really trying to make that tie and have that understanding. Also, when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, we always mention that that adverse childhood experiences are never the responsibility of the child. Even if that child is now an adult, that experience as a child was not the responsibility of the child. And the generational clarity term is really based on actually an experience of with my own son, and myself being really impressed and overwhelmed actually by a young girl that I met who was just so rooted in her culture, and it was really beautiful. And I was telling my son about it, and and said, you know, I didn't have that experience, but you know, I have always looked for it. And anyway, from where I'm from, we talk about our roots go to the center of the earth. And so thinking along those lines, it really gives you motivation to support that thinking and the new ones coming up, that they are rooted in their culture, and support that. So I feel strongly about it. I took that terminology to the Leadership Advisory Council, and they really supported it. And with the concept of that, you know, that terminology it helps us to be able to talk about things in a way that does not do harm. Because when we use the term historical trauma, sometimes those terms of them in and of themselves create a triggering effect. I'm going to try and move more quickly. So what does this mean in terms of food systems? So, you know, it was in 2016 that we convened a work group on access to healthy foods. And right away, what we heard back was, well, how do we advocate for food sovereignty? And these are the issues that were raised. Again, that was in 2016. So all of these issues were raised. And Cindy and I had been working with a couple of tribes, actually working on doing some creating and designing some assessment tools with those tribal communities. And so they were some of the people that joined this initial work group. From that, we actually convened 2 food sovereignty summits. One was in 2017. It was a day of learning. It was a community-driven agenda, and for this summit, folks really wanted to bring people together, gather together, experience the foods together, experience the how-tos, share knowledge on a community level. And so that's what we did. It was a beautiful event. And I'm just going to pause and ask Cindy to share maybe some of her thinking about that event. Are you there, Cindy?
I am. Sorry,
Okay.
just had to unmute.
Okay.
Yes, that was it was just amazing how everything came together and everyone was ready to talk about it. And of course, some of the most exciting part of it too is always the meal and the meal with traditional foods and preparation, and just how fulfilling and sustaining and nourishing that was. But just all the talk and discussion, the herbal tea bar, there was so many components of it that were just really rich. But we did learn that that everyone is ready. Everyone's ready to talk about it and how the importance of our food sovereignty, and then how can we work together to really continue this work and support it in all of our communities.
Yeah, and thank you, Cindy. And so that was, you know, certainly a driving force for us to do the next one, because we continued to meet with the work group, and you know, they actually had in the early stages, once we decided that we were going to really focus on community-driven agenda in that first one, they already had an agenda for the policy level summit, and so we really had to do that too. We were, you know, doing a lot of fundraising in order to make that happen, but it did, and it was a great summit as well. And actually, a day was present for that summit, and many, you know, many other people. We actually had a number of tribal leaders that co-chaired that event, and Chairman Forsman actually was one of the leaders that had talked to me early on about he would really like for us to bring some of that knowledge about what's going on the national level to Washington State. And so that was impetus too for us to reach out to a day and to Janie Hipp, who was also at that event. Okay, and then in 2017, there was a Tribal Environmental Public Health Summit. And this was a summit that we worked with the Department of Health and their environmental public health division. And this was really interesting because we came in with this thinking about policy systems and environmental change based upon the work that we had been doing, and I think the state had a really different, view, of course, what is sort of the standard traditional environmental public health. And so here are some of the issues that actually have been raised as potential tribal environmental public health issues. And you can see some of these cross over into the natural resources territory, but there were many speakers, tribal leaders, there were many speakers from tribal environments that talked about, many of these topics. And I think it was a really incredible learning experience for those that were from local public health jurisdictions and from the state. In fact, we heard that afterwards. So learnings from the food sovereignty summits. I'll just go through this pretty quickly. This probably won't be too surprising to folks, but just in the work to describe food sovereignty, culture as prevention certainly came up, but just a few things: regaining and teaching traditional knowledge about culture and foods, physical access to our land and acknowledging our treaty rights, eating traditional foods and the importance of involving elders, knowledge keepers, youth in the community. Protective factors to food sovereignty, communities working together, relationship building, elders and youth really play an important role. The integration of traditional medicine into health services. Strength-based stories about healing creates a sense of connection, and that sense of connection we hear a lot about in terms of the trauma-informed strategies, even in sort of mainstream thinking. And then barriers and challenges to food sovereignty, government regulation, non-native use of resources and historical trauma, climate change, loss of supply of fish and game, declining availability of traditional foods and smaller animals, pollutants, water toxicity, loss of access to gathering spaces, lack of teachers, and fear of not knowing. Okay, now we can go to the panel, and we're going to begin with Ade Romero Brios, Director of Programs, Native Agriculture and Food Systems, First Nations Development Institute. And Aubrey, could you, let's see, I have to get my, can you shut me off for a minute? And I'm going to pull up Ade's slides. And Ade, would you mind then beginning with a self-introduction while I pull up your slides? Thank you.
Okay, Goetzi se hopa hin waka ni masa wat yats kutitima osata. Oi mahada. My name is Ade Briones and I work for First Nations Development Institute. I'm the director of the Native Agriculture and Food Systems Initiative. And forgive me first because these webinars are a little weird. Like I can't see anybody, so I don't know if it feels like I'm talking to myself. So that's always a little awkward. So please forgive me. And I'm getting a little screen. Yeah, well, it went away. Okay, so technical difficulties. And I thank you again for spending some time with us this afternoon. And for really listening to me. I think when we do these presentations, it's sort of weird for First Nations to present, just because I think when it comes to the equation of what Indian country is doing to protect our food and lands and water and resources and people, we're the least important in the equation. We're really just like a small funder, and we are really here to support the tribal leaders and the people who are working on the ground. So I always feel like I want to hear from you more than people want to hear from me. But again, I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you all today. And
Thank
so
you,
first,
Ade. Can I just ask you to pause for a moment? And Aubrey, are you sharing my screen now?
if it's too
There
hard,
we go.
I can just go ahead. Oh, here we go. Yes. Again, we come from, we work with, we're mainly all Indigenous staff working to support tribal communities and tribally led nonprofits. And so we all come from whatever community that we, were born and raised in, and we try to give to Indigenous people. So that's a little different. I'm sure most of the folks, whether you're tribal leaders or whether you're working in a nonprofit or you're working with the grassroots, know that philanthropy is like a really weird space. And so First Nations are like whole organization is really meant to be supportive of Indigenous people, of Indigenous principles, and to advocate for Indigenous people in the world of philanthropy. And so really that's what I'm going to share with you today, like what we see in the field. And I know Jan talked about food sovereignty and climate change. And I have to say, like in our work and when we talk to grassroots people, like those words we don't ever use. Like people are fishermen, or people are corn growers, or people are working on like land access. Like some of these terminologies come directly from the world of philanthropy, and it kind of changes the conversation a little bit. And so I just want to say, like, no matter what work you're doing in this space, it's really, really important. You know, there's a story from one of our organizations who shared with us, you know, like when explorers first came to California, they visit Yosemite, and they called the big rock like El Capitan because it was like the biggest rock and it was like the leader. But the indigenous people called it the place of the worm because like the worm is the most important. It's the least visible and it's like on the ground. And really that's how I think of this work in food sovereignty. It's really easy to put people who are like advocating or on Facebook or in all these spaces and see them out there doing their thing. But it's really, our work really is about like supporting those on the ground and supporting those who have their hands in the dirt or their fishing net out there, or the ones who are like advocating with their city council people to give access to land. And so really it is a crazy world when it comes to philanthropy and food sovereignty and indigenous peoples and indigenous rights right now. There's like so many things happening in the food sovereignty space around land, environment, and food. It's kind of hard to navigate. So as I go through my presentation, hopefully my goal is to leave you at least with one fact or insight that you can then use in your advocacy work, because really the work is done by people like you who are out there, and we just get to support it. So please, I don't know how to, I guess, does somebody change this for me or do I? Okay. Again, I'm from the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, and that's my daughter there and my nieces. And I'm also, you know, I'm at the honor of speaking with you, so I just wanted to give you a little bit about who I am next. And I'm also from Cochiti, so I was born and raised in Cochiti. That's our field, you know, born and raised in a place where mainly people grew their own food or hunted their own food. And so really I come from that space. I eventually went to law school and I do food and agricultural law, but really the most important, I think, lessons, like anybody can go pick up a law book and read it. Anybody can like probably have access to the institutions that will give you a degree, but very, very few people in this world have access to communities who have knowledge that is based on their homelands, like people in Cochiti or people who live along the coast, or if there's tribal people who are working in their community, like to me that's like gold. That's a terrible example, but that's like really where the goods are, because that's the stuff you can't learn in a book. That's the stuff you can't learn how to see the world unless somebody there's to guide you, unless you have a community to interact with. And so that's one of the things that we see in our work, is like we really, really advocate for protection, because there's right now, the way the world is, there's so much interest in Indigenous people and our knowledge bases. We really have to be careful and protect not only that knowledge, but the people who maintain that knowledge and the structures that make sure it's transferred generation to generation without compromising the integrity of that knowledge and those systems, which is exactly what food is. Next. I'm married at the Big Valley Rancheria, and that's my husband and my son. And really, like, again, all the work we do is influenced by, not like me, for example. I felt like it was really important to tell you where I come from, because it influences the work that we do and the work we support, just like all of you out there who think of, I would love for you to think about your work and how it influences how you think about food, and how it influences your advocacy for not only your people, but for the state and for the cultural protections. Like all of that comes from our experiences. And again, like the tribal experiences to me are the most valuable, but that's not always recognized outside of our communities. But that's where everybody wants to be. That's like where institutions are fighting to learn. And we see in philanthropy, people use a lot of terms to describe an Indigenous knowledge bases, and I'll go through that a little more in my presentation. Next. And I showed you the picture of the California Delta here, because one of the places we see a lot of intersections in the food sovereignty work, especially around Indigenous people, and I'm sure all of you, I'm talking to people in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm sure all of you see this intersection. One is that when people talk about agriculture, they're talking about a whole lot of things, right? Like people, like mainstream America will think of the farmer and think of the corn and think of like maybe the cabin and the settlers. But really, when they're talking about agriculture, it's already kind of setting up a conversation where Indigenous people are not included. Because in order to have agriculture, right, people need land, people need water, people need all these things that kind of started at the point when Indigenous people were attempting to be eradicated. And so we see a lot of those effects today. We see the alteration. First, we saw like they came and chopped down all the trees and then altered all the waterways. And then now they want to have, mainstream, and I say they as in mainstream America, wants to have conversations about agriculture and food sovereignty and Indigenous practices without necessarily addressing the word agriculture from the beginning. And so it's really important, like when we think about waterways, and like I live in the California Delta, where almost every river is gated or locked. Salmon can't make it up the rivers, and like we're surrounded by farms. But this is like the crux of where these conversations need to happen, because when people talk about climate change, when people talk about destruction of lands and our society, like environmental degradation, or whether it be pesticides, rarely do we hear people talking about Indigenous people and land theft and like the importance of undamming waterways. And really, we're kind of pitted against agriculture as a network, which in turn kind of pits us against like America as a society. And these are very like grandiose ideas, but we see the fallout of these kind of conversations and these kinds of frameworks in how foundations and governments fund food sovereignty. And so we're really trying to challenge the way people think about agriculture, the way people think about food systems, because those conversations affect how money flows and what kind of projects are funded. And if you look at philanthropy, you know, it used to be in 2017, I remember giving the presentation and I said 0.03% of philanthropic dollars go to Indigenous projects in this space. Well, it's actually gotten a lot worse. You know, we saw uptick because of Standing Rock, but now we see like a minus, so only 0.06% of philanthropic dollars are going to Indian country. And of course, now we're in a national like awakening where people are more interested in what they call BIPOC, which is a term I hate, right? Because they throw Indigenous people with every other brown person in America and say they're really interested in funding, you know, Native-led or Black-led initiatives. But again, I like the warning is like once Indigenous people are kind of ushered onto this term BIPOC, which you hear a lot in philanthropy and which you hear a lot in government conversations right now, it doesn't necessarily recognize the rights of Indigenous or tribal nations, right? We're not just like any other brown folk. We're governments that pre-existed before America came, and that term doesn't necessarily recognize that, but you hear that term so much. 2020, that like, you can do a Google search and you'll come up thousands of times. Next. And so, you know, Jan talked about salmon, and I'm so glad I had this picture of salmon in here because really what we're talking about is, you know, our relatives, right? Here's our relatives. And, you know, through mainstream America's eyes, like those Indians are at it fighting for the fish again, or those Indians are at it fighting for deer again, or fighting for the elk, whatever it may be. But this represents like this just kind of illustrates the time frames that we're talking about, because, you know, like Salmon Nation, they would go up the streams and they would come down. Their bodies are basically why California has some of the most fertile grounds in America. This is why some of the most fertile grounds are in the Pacific Northwest, is because we're built on generations upon generations of Salmon Nation, of our relatives who have died and literally have fertilized our soils, right? But in American culture, like it's just a fish, or it's you know, they're affecting what's getting into the way we allocate water in our agricultural communities without thinking holistically about the timelines of how agriculture happened, of why the soils are so fertile. And the reason I bring this up is because in philanthropy and environmental conservation and in you know, food sovereignty conversations, everybody is talking about the soil right now, right? Because everybody wants, you know, you'll hear the term carbon sequestration in not only regenerative agriculture, but agroecology. But nobody, and they're talking about carbon atoms, but they're not talking about the salmon, which is like the most, if we want to talk about carbon, salmon is probably the biggest propagator of carbon sequestration, because it's like we're all carbon, but salmon in itself is the carbon that we now are trying to protect. And so like the time frames are really funny, and the conversations are really funny when we don't include our conversations about the salmon. And so it's really important to remind people when they're in agriculture, when they're talking about carbon sequestration, that salmon are the reason why we have a carbon cycle, really. Like, that is the beginning. That is then perpetuated through the water systems, that's then perpetuated in our environment, perpetuated through our bodies, and then the cycle goes over again. So these conversations are happening in food sovereignty and mainstream agriculture, but oftentimes, again, I tell you, Indigenous people are not included, and they see like our conversations and our actions around food sovereignty, food systems, undamming waterways, and about the salmon as something else, as something outside of that conversation. And so First Nations really advocates for the inclusion, and it's really hard. It's really hard because not everybody has an open mind. And again, like, these conversations are important because it determines where philanthropic dollars flow. And many of our communities can do without philanthropic dollars, like they'll be fed without the money from philanthropy. And we absolutely, I think even if we had zero philanthropic dollars, Indian people would find a way. But it's important that these systems are also validated and protected. And sometimes a lot of people only understand dollar signs. Unless it has a value, it's not important. So it's a really complicated conversation and situation, but that's where food sovereignty is happening. That's where we're trying to make the fight. I think for us, we get to support all of you on the ground who are doing the actual work, and our job is to make sure people understand, and we're advocating for Indigenous frameworks. Next. And so, Jen said, we have projects all across the country. My program gave out $9 million since our inception. Since COVID happened, First Nations has a COVID response fund, and I will leave my email address in the chat box for all of you. If there's some interest, we serve rural and reservation-based communities per our articles of incorporation. And so with all of these projects across the country, Alaska and Hawaii, one of our questions was what makes a tribal food economy? If you look this up on Google and just put tribal food economy, you're not going to get this picture, because one of the reasons is institutions outside Indian country and philanthropic institutions understand food economy in a very simplistic way. Indigenous people have very complex food systems. And when we asked the majority of our grantees in the NAFC program, some of them, and these are basic things that I think Indigenous people easily conceptualize, is that, we need our artists to be part of the food sovereignty conversations, because that's how we communicate our values. That's how we incorporate our values from generation to generation. So artists are really important. Some people said, we don't have retail, we don't have a restaurant on the reservation, but we have people who have food sales, or we have grandmas and grandpas who who cook the food, or who will make the jerky and then make sure it circulates in the economy. Those are important. And so I stress, there's some communities have formal food economies, some have informal food economies, but each one is necessary for the functioning of the maintenance of our lands and waters. And these are things I'm sure everybody understands, but we just are here to kind of articulate what some of our grantees are saying, and to make pretty pictures so people can use them, and maybe it'll help somebody explain their food project or their values to someone outside the community a little easier. That's one of our jobs. Is hopefully we can give you language, or give somebody language that will make the conversation just a little bit easier. The other thing that's really different than regular food economy is the hunters. The hunters are really, really important. They're some of, we have an ecological stewardship program at First Nations, and the ecological stewards or ecological managers are our hunters, the ones who go out every season and notice the change in migrations, or notice the change in habitats, or notice the change in waterways. Like, they're really important to the functioning of our food economies. An economy is not like cash economy. An economy is like how we manage what we have, whether it be land, whether it be water, whether it be food. And you know, like, ceremony is really, really important. And all of these things in a tribal food economy, you're not necessarily going to find in a mainstream food economy. And so it was important for us to put this all down so that people can see, like, they're really complex systems. And when funders say, well, you know, we don't really fund art, but you can say, no, you know what, like, art is part of our food economy. It's an important part of the food economy. And so this is what this graphic is meant to do. Next. And lastly, this is my last slide, I think. Jan talked a little bit about culture is everything, or I'm paraphrasing Jan. And so we did this, we did this graphic because we really wanted people to understand that, like, when we get a food grant in Indian country, it's not always the same thing. You can't measure it the same way. So like, a lot of foundations will say, like, okay, you got to tell us how many, or like, think about the agricultural ag census that they send out to Indian country every couple of years. They always ask, like, how much money have you made from your food? And a lot of indigenous producers or people in food sovereignty are like, what? Like, what do you mean how much money? And you know, there's one, like, not a long record, like, people don't keep receipts about what they sold, but two, there's a lot of people who really are resistant to selling whatever they make or whatever they catch or whatever they hunt. And in some cases it's even illegal. So like, those questions about, like, how much have you sold as a measure of success is really weird. And the other, like, metric that a lot of foundations use is, like, how many pounds have come out of your garden? And we're saying, like, you know, there's a lot more complexity than that. And sometimes those aren't the best measurements. And so foundations didn't understand what we were saying. So we did this little graphic to kind of illustrate. And so first, like, there's a resistance to commodifying a lot of our natural resources, like land, energy, water, and like health, even individual health, are considered collective resources. So it's not like anybody can own them or benefit from them. And of course, these are generalizations, right? There's nuances in every community in Indian country, Alaska or Hawaii. These are just like a base. Like, you can take these and you can play with them and make them reflect your own community, but this is just to give, like, some kind of base to start the conversation. And so when we're talking about collective resources like land and water, in order to manage those, you need so many different kinds of skill sets. In a mainstream economy, like, those things can be commodified. So you really need just like a way to, like, what they have, the structures they have, which are like, you have titles, you have like county governments who record those titles, and you go there and you look in the files. Like, there's systems that are set up for their system. In our system, where there's the collective resources can't be commodified, you need a lot more skill sets. You need a lot more communication skills. You need to be able to know how to cooperate. You have to be able to, you have to be a good trader in a way. You have to be able to negotiate a whole lot more than just like going to the county recorder's office to go find the title. And so once that's commodified, like, it really puts a, I can't, so you see the line where it has a lot of dollar signs, that's really like a wall, right? Like, unless you have money, you can't really access those collective resources. But in our community, like, if you have a person who knows how to negotiate, you have a hunter, you have a seed person, like, you're going to access those resources. And really, in the mainstream culture, you're measuring by individual success. In the indigenous food system, you're looking at community well-being. And all of that to say, those collective resources make sure, like, we have institutions that are functional, like our economic, spiritual, political, educational and social institutions are based on how we manage those collective resources among one another. And just the same in the mainstream food system, their institutions are based on like managing their resources, which are commodified and have price tags. Food then becomes like the indicator for Indigenous people when something is wrong with the food system, when there's food shortages, when there's a lack, when there's sick food, whether that be like our deer or our plants or our water, like that tells us something is wrong. Something is amiss in one of our institutions that has to be corrected. In a mainstream food system, the only people that access food are the ones that can pay for it, right? Or the ones that can get subsidized or somehow access that food through cash. And so that in itself sets another barrier up where institutions are insulated and they don't tell us. So like when there's a food shortage, it doesn't tell us much in a mainstream food system, except like maybe somebody doesn't have money. And it really speaks to only the economic institution. So like the society in itself can't adjust. And so you're really stuck in this place where like you only know you cash and like the money value is really like a short-term indicator for that society. But in an Indigenous food system, like our food, as Jen said earlier, is everything, right? Like our food is part of our culture, is part of our spiritual well-being, is part of our educational institutions. And so when food is not functioning properly, like that's a sign to the society that they need to respond to something. And so when we talk about food sovereignty, we're really talking about the entirety of who we are, the entirety of the community functioning, as opposed to food security, which is the main focus of mainstream food systems, and how to create more secure food resources, which mainly how to alleviate cash shortages or money to access those foods. Next. Really complex, but it's a pretty picture. Like I do better with pictures. Next.
Let's see. Is there a next one?
Oh, I
think that was the last
Well,
slide.
that was some of the work we do at First Nations. We have several grantees in the Pacific Northwest. We have several open grant opportunities, and I really welcome any conversation. And one of my favorite things is just interacting with Indigenous communities. Often we have to give presentations to non-Indigenous communities, and those can get crazy. So I welcome any conversation with you, and please look at our website, look at our open RFPs, and I hope to hear from some of you soon. And I'll write my email in the chat box. So thank you.
Ade, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your presentation. That was really wonderful. Do you happen to see my slide that is announcing the Gather Food Sovereignty?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
I do.
So
thank you for putting that out there.
Yeah, so that came to me in a message just prior to our session today. And so I thought it was a very good timing. So did you want to address this in any way?
No, that's one of our open RFPs.
Okay.
So we welcome applications, and join our webinar tomorrow and we'll give more details about it.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. And just one other thing is that I did see Gather, the documentary that First Nations Development Institute produced. Yes.
Yes.
And
yeah, please watch Gather. We worked with Jason Momoa and Sanjay Raw to kind of highlight some of the our grantees, but also to talk about like the policies that affected our food systems historically, because one last thing is we call it the Indian tax at First Nations. Like when we go into a conversation, we find ourselves having to explain, well, you know, like there was this thing like land theft happened, and then like they sent our kids to boarding schools, and then like kind of took away our land and put dams. Like all of these things that have happened to Indigenous people like have to be explained over and over and over again. So Gather was our attempt to kind of like do it all at once.
Oh, and so those of you that are on the webinar, if you haven't seen it yet, I definitely recommend it, and definitely can relate to now the Indian tax. I'm going to be borrowing your term. So,
and if anybody is out there who doesn't have access to Gather, one, we're giving free access to Gather. We're on iTunes and Amazon, and we're going on Netflix. But if you email me, I can send you DVDs, or I can send you a link to a free iTunes link for your community, because we want Indigenous people to see this for free.
well, thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I know that you're going to have to leave, right? You have another commitment. So I'm just wondering if there are any questions before we make the shift to our next speaker.
I can't see the question. I can't, my chat, it doesn't seem to be working, so I don't.
Aubrey, could you let us know if there are any questions?
Yes, and I did unmute everybody if they want to speak for a moment.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
I feel like I'm on this thing by myself.
I know. Sorry. I know. I feel the same way. It feels very strange. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
anyway tolerating that to join us. It's where we're at, and I'm not very good at maneuvering through this GoToWebinar, so it's the first time that we've been using it this way. We've used other formats. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Ade. Just really appreciate your time and the good work that you're doing out there. Looking forward to our next connection.
Thank you, Jan, and keep up the good work as well.
Okay, stay well. Oh, great. Okay, so we're ready to move on to our next speaker, and that's Charlene Christ, the Vice Chair of the Squaxin Island Tribe. Charlene, are you there with us?
I'm here. Can you
Wonderful.
hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
and can we put Charlene on video so we can see her too, Aubrey? Great, thank you. Oh, thank you for joining us again, Charlene. It's always such a pleasure to have your presence, and I really feel that way. You know I do. So thank you so much for joining us, and I know you have a message to share with us, and I'm just gonna let you go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. My name is Charlene Christ, and I'm the Vice Chair of Squaxin Island Tribe. And I also am the Executive Director for the Museum Library Research Center. And I'm speaking from an ancestral area that we call Camelchi. Camelchi in our language is peaceful valley. Right now I'm on top of a hill, and below is a beautiful valley. The valley is still abundant filled with elk, deer, wild cougars and bears, and so we still live in kind of a very kind of a wilderness area, even though we're right by Highway 101, and But the reality is that the wildlife is still here. And our people have always called the wildlife, the deer, the elk, the birds in the air, our ancestors, our Siyaya. Siyaya meaning all our relatives. The very trees that are here, we've got Douglas fir, we've got cedars and other indigenous trees that are standing tall among us. And our people have always said they too are the ancestors. They are alive. And the very rocks that we step on, the very sand, the dirt is alive to our people. I had one tribal elder who said, always remember that we are of this land, and the land is constantly the animal nation, the plant nation, the birds in the sky. They're always watching us, and they're always wanting to reconnect with us. We have been like the wandering child that has went too far away, and the ancestors want us to come back into that alignment with who we really are. And who we are as Native Indigenous people is we are of this land. We drink the waters that come from the land. Oh, they come from the sky too. We drink of these waters, but we also still eat a lot of the natural plants that come from the very lands. Of course, we have some that are shipped in from other areas, agricultural areas. Our tribal people here, we are salmon people. We eat a lot of salmon. Salmon's an important part of our diet, and so is the shellfish. My people, we were one of the wealthiest tribal people. Squaxin Island is a Squaxarapsh, Sahewamish, Sahawamish, Nusheshados, Stachas. We are the people of the water, not only of marine water, saltwater people, but we also of the creeks, of the rivers, of the different watersheds. That's who we are as Native people. And when I think of food sovereignty, I can't but help to think of the big picture, the ancestral heritage picture of who we are as Native people. The sovereignty has been with us for eons, for decades, for centuries, for thousands of years. Some of the artifacts that have been found in our area have been dated from the time of the glacier, when the glacier was retreating. I think that's the word they use, when it was moving. It was receding. That's the word I was looking for. The receding of the glaciers. That puts us about anywhere from 10 to 14,000 years. I might have those years kind of wrong, but it's really ancient people. That's who we are here at the where I'm speaking from. Being people of the land and that relationship has always been important. With the signing of the Treaty of 1854, that was the beginning of the fragmentation of the loss of that land and the loss of some of the knowledge. It actually came before the treaties where the newcomers were coming into the land, and our people were very fascinated with the newcomers. Can you imagine never seeing somebody with beautiful blue eyes and beautiful pale skin, and oh my gosh, did you see that lady's hair? It was bright red. Oh, it was beautifully blonde. Could you imagine being a tribal person in the 1800s and just totally fascinated with these newcomers? That was our tribal people. Our tribal people, not only were they fascinated with them, they also were very intrigued in their ways, their language, and what it is that they like to eat. And then at times, there was this sincere care and worry for them because these people did not know about these tides. Hey, you got to pull that canoe farther up the beach. The tide's going to come in really high this time. And they didn't know about certain bushes to stay away from, or certain animals and how they act. And that was no baby you heard crying in the woods last night. That was a cougar. And because somebody heard a baby crying, they thought it was a baby and it was actually a cougar. And our tribal people had this care and worry for the new pioneers that they set out to help them. And we became their good neighbor. We became the ones that, you're not feeling good? I have the medicine for you. Let me give you these teas. You drink these teas this time and this time. And by the way, I need you to eat these foods. Because when our tribal people would look at the healing of somebody, it was holistic healing. It wasn't just, oh, you got a fever. No, it was to make sure that whole entirety of the person, you understood what was going on and you helped them to get better. Did I tell you my tribe is Squaxin Island tribe from the Medicine Creek Nation? Our people were accustomed to understanding the medicines. The medicines were the food. The food was the medicine. Of course, the teas also were medicine. Our tribal people here in the Northwest, the Squaxin Island people, we were one of the wealthiest people. Mile per mile, we had the most productive shellfish beaches. All our watersheds, we have hills that some people think are mountains. They're hills to us. They're big hills. The watersheds, all the life in there, the deer, the elk, or whatever life that were there, were so abundant. And our people had such abundance of food. There was a protocol on how you would take care of this food. You never wanted to waste any food, and you never wanted to do things haphazardly, meaning you had to have everything ready. So if you're going to go out and shoot that elk, you need to be able to have everything ready so that you're going to carry that elk back to your people, and that everything's going to get ready for the elk hide and the cutting of the meat, and the ceremony was a very important part of it. Of course, we wanted to celebrate the gift. The gift of the elk wasn't just the hunter that went out and got it, but we recognized that that elk just gave its life. That elk had a heart that was beaten. No, that elk now was given its life for us. And so in that protocol that our people had, when it came to indigenous sovereignty, that food, we need to make sure that that protocol was followed right down to the very T, because we wanted to make sure that people had that recognition and that relationship to the natural resources of the land stayed strong. That relationship to the natural resources, whether it be the animal nation or the plant nation or the tree nation, was the foundation of who we are as indigenous people here in this territory where I speak from, Camelchi. When I say we were one of the wealthiest people, our people would have these ceremonies called potlatch. Potlatch was a gift-giving ceremony, and it was something that was practiced not just in my area right here, but the tribes here in the Northwest had this ceremony called the potlatching, and they would think about gifting goods to people for years, and they would identify certain individuals who they wanted to give these gifts to. And these individuals, if I were being the one to be the gifter, I would be thinking about you for years, and I would know so much about you that the gift that I would give you, I know with no doubt that you needed or that you could put to good use. So in these potlatchen, we have a written document, and it was written by an early pioneer lady, and she was writing to her son, and she said, I went to this large house. In this large house, there were these several fires, huge fires, 10 of them burning in the center of this big building. All along the center were these smaller fires, and tending these smaller fires were these women who were working on preparation of food. And in the preparation of food, you could see all the smoke billowing up into the rafters and out the opening. And she said, all along the side of the building, you could see all these old people. And she said, I just can't understand how they could live so long. And so here it is, the food preparation. And then she says, and then there's these drummers come out and they have square drums and they start drumming and all the food is taken away with such finesse. And she didn't say that word, but I'm trying to condense it because I really don't know how much time I have here. So I'm maybe kind of moving this fast. So she said, the food is taken out. And then the speaker, he says to everybody in the language, tonight we have the governor visiting with us. And so the governor comes before the people in this big long house. And she said, and this spokesperson, the native spokesperson, he identifies the governor and translate what he's saying to the people. And I kind of have we have tribal members that have these big voices. You do not need to give them a microphone because they could just be talking like this and their voice carries. They've got such a wonderful speaking voice. They don't need no mic. And the person they identified was a Henry. Our people here, the Henry people, they have this magnificent speaking voice. So Henry, the native translator, was the one who was translating. And they did the prayer, blessing of the floors, but I wanted to kind of give you a visual of the interior of our tribal houses, that our people, when they would host, it was about the food, but it also was about this part of showing that our connection was to the land, the knowledge, our ancestral knowledge. It had a lot of science behind it, the science of years of observation, of understanding the certain mechanisms that goes on with the natural earth science, but also with the changes of the weather. So people understood about what was happening in the atmosphere, the studying of the stars, and how the stars and the moon changed at the tilt of the earth. But I'm sure they didn't understand fully about the tilt of the earth, but they understood about the celestial, what was going on, and the impacts and how the changes of the season. Here we have the teachings that are called Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is the north, south, east, west, spring, summer, fall, winter, infant, child, adult, elder. All these things come in together again for the teachings of who we are as Indigenous people, that we have this connection back to the land, to the earth. When the tribal people had the potlatch, our people had what was called the eating contest. We never wanted anyone to leave our houses without making sure they were completely satisfied and had food. So they actually were these contests where trays would be brought out and to see, I want to see how much you could eat. Can you eat more? And so these trays would be brought up. And when people were done with their tray, to let the people know that I want some more, they would just toss the tray out so that people would come and pick it up and take it back to them. Food. Food was a necessity here. But let's talk about the food. Food to our tribal people had life, and that life needed respect. To this day, we still have a lot of respect for the indigenous foods that we take. As a salmon person, we always give thanks to the Creator for the gift of the salmon. We also have these creatures that are called Gooey Ducks. They're really big, like, I don't know if you can see my hands. They're just huge shellfish with these huge long necks that if the necks were stretched out, they're almost like 6 feet. Big looking shellfish. Our people love Gooey Duck. These foods have a relationship to our history. And that relationship, even to this day, is an important part of who we are. When we prepare food, our tribal people always want to make sure that our mind and our spirit is in a good way. So if I'm going to be your cook, you want to make sure that Charlene's got her spirituality on good, because you don't want me in the kitchen when I'm mad and throwing things around. You don't want to eat that person's food. You want to eat the food of someone who's like, I'm preparing this food for you, and I put my prayers into this food. Whatever you may be going through, or I pray a blessing as I'm preparing this wonderful elk meat for you, that it's for you to rejuvenate you. There's a lot of teachings among our people here in the Northwest where we still implement, we still tell our cooks to be mindful of when you're cooking, to make sure that you put goodness into that food. People like their salt and pepper. Salish people, we like the goodness into our food. When I think about food sovereignty, I also think about how, as a young person, I remember my dad taking us out to the beach, and we were just little kids. And he'd have us explore, and my dad was actually really intelligent, and have us, take a look at all the creatures that were living under the rocks that might be coming ashore or on the low tide. And we'd spend hours out there, and he'd be walking along with us, telling us about the foods and the creatures. And we even dug some shellfish up. And so those memories, connections, those feel-good moments as a person, for me, has been about the food. I believe too, there's a fragrance when we cook, that fragrance that reaches out, and it's like those loving arms that come out to you and they just kind of caress you. And we also believe that's an important part of that food that helps bring us to that place of like everything else can just drop away, and it's just time to enjoy this gift. And so when I think of the food sovereignty, I also believe that there's the health factor. Years ago, I was talking to a man who was saying that he had looked at the Indian Health Service, did this study on other tribes, and Squaxin had scored in the 10th percentile. And he goes, that's pretty good because nationwide, this is tribe by tribe. And he said, well, why do you think that is, Charlene? I go, I think it's this. Our tribal people are very active. Our people still go out and harvest shellfish. Our people are Gooey Duckers. We also are Salmon people, not just the men, but as women. And our people go out and hunt the elk and deer, not just men, but also women. We teach our young people these ways too, because we believe that it is about the health. And our people had longevity of life, but part of that longevity was diminished by not having that access to traditional lands, to those traditional roots, those the camas or the wild carrots or the wild onions, and not all of those we couldn't have for a few generations. Right now, we're in the process of trying to restore those opportunities to be able to go out and harvest those. There's some obstacles, but we're still working on that. I mentioned a little bit about the well-being of how like the fragrance of food is so good for us. It's like the caress. And also with food, there's something about it that just really is important part of our genetic makeup of who we are. When I was younger, I was pregnant with my first child, and I had this strange, I wanted to eat something that snapped. And all I could think about something like chalk. And I knew I didn't want to eat chalk. It wasn't chalk, really. I didn't want to eat chalk. Well, anyways, I went to this conference, and there was a Kaya, a grandmother, and she had a bandana on her head. And I go up to her, and our eyes, we meet. And I'm looking at her. She comes, come here, come here. So I go up to her table, and I was a little bit shy back then. And as I go up there, she goes, honey, try this. She's having me try these things. And one of them, I put in my mouth, and it was what I wanted. It is what my spirit wanted when I was pregnant with my first child. And I told her, I said, what is this? And she told me it was a dried camas, the kind from Eastern Washington. My mother is Colville Confederated tribe. My mother's passed on. My mother is a descendant of those of the Nez Perce that were imprisoned in Nez Pelham. And my mother grew up in Nez Pelham. My mother, Dorothy Lucy Nampuya, she lived with her grandmother. And so she didn't have very good English. Her English was very broken. And because she spoke her original Salish language. But somewhere in there, that dried camas, my spirit knew that my body needed it. I believe, and this is a different elder that said, we have a genetic makeup and there's a genetic memory inside of us that science will discover more and more about. Tribal people have known it for years about this genetic memory. And there's a calling out from the natural foods of the land, and the foods are calling to us as tribal people that we need to come back to the traditional foods. And maybe we don't know everything about it, but we can learn. We're always learning. And so I also wanted to mention a little bit about the economic of food, the economics of food. In 1974, here in Washington State, was the Judge Boat decision. That Judge Boat decision was pretty much telling the state of Washington, you are held legally responsible to uphold the Treaty of 1854. The tribal people here have the rights to go harvest their salmon. And so 1974 for our tribal people was a calling back home for many of us to come back. And when our tribal people came back, it was a struggle. It was not so easy because we didn't have here, especially at Squaxin, we did not have hardly any land base. Our tribal people had to purchase land because we had just a few spots, and that was at Steamboat Island, and it was already occupied by tribal people, but there was not enough land base. So our people had to kind of find that economic, when I wanted to talk about how food sovereignty is different in economics to us, is because the salmon brought us back. And of course we wanted to eat salmon, but at the same time, there was a market to sell the salmon. And because of that, it helped propel our people, almost like launch us into other areas. And these are the areas. It helped us with our culture. Before the Judge Boat decision, we all had pieces of the culture, like a big jigsaw puzzle. But when everybody started to return back, everybody had portions of the culture, and we rebuilt. Back in 1950s, our tribe was, the Squaxin Island tribe was almost terminated. 1960s, we were so poor. We didn't have hardly any people and funds. 1960s, 70s, there were about 100 of us. 1980s, we were up to 300 tribal members. I still remember that. I knew everybody in our tribe. And then 1980s, we really got acquainted with each other. 1990s, if you recall, late 1990s, we got into the casino. People said, how's it that you guys are in casino? Shouldn't that be in Nevada? And our tribal people, we've been in the gambling for quite some time was Slahal bone games. Did you know that up in Lummi there was Slahal bone pieces, bone games that were found in an archaeological site? I believe they were like 11,000 years old. So tribal people have been in the gambling for quite a long time. When our tribal people got back to this area, Camelchi, there was a cultural resurgence. And a cultural resurgence began with a song. And the song, what was it? It was Blessing of the Food. And so I'm going to just go a few more minutes, Jan, because I'm not sure how long I have. In 2012, Squaxin hosted the canoe journey.